In the last lecture, you learned about logical operators. In all the examples you saw in the last lecture, we use these logical operators with boolean values. But in JavaScript, unlike many other programming languages, we can use these logical operators with non-boolean values. And that's extremely powerful. Let me show you a few examples. Let's say we have false or true. What do you think is the result of this expression? Well, it's true, right? Now, what if we have false or the string mosh? What do you think is the result of this expression? Well, let's take a look. We get mosh back. What if we have false or number one? We get number one back. So here's the first thing you need to realize. The result of a logical expression is not necessarily a true or false. That depends on the value of the operands we have. In the first example, our second operand is true. That's why we get true back. In the second example, our second operand is a string. That's why we get a string back. And by the same token, in the third example, we get a number back. So when our JavaScript engine tries to evaluate this expression, it looks at each operand. If that operand is not a Boolean true or false, it will try to interpret it as what we call truthy or falsy. So in JavaScript, we have these values which we refer to as falsy. That's not a Boolean false, it's falsy. What are these falsy values? Well, we have undefined, null, number 0, the Boolean false, an empty string, and not a number. Now, we haven't talked about this yet. That's going to come later in the course. For now, just remember, not a number is a special value in JavaScript. And when we're dealing with a mathematical calculation that does not produce a valid number, this value is returned, not a number. Now, we're going to look at that later in the course, so don't worry about it. So these are the falsy values in JavaScript. If we use any of these values in a logical expression, they will be treated as falsy, which is kind of like a Boolean false, but it's not exactly the same. Now, anything that is not falsy is truthy. So, back to these examples. In the second example, our second operand is a string with 4 characters. So this is not an empty string, it's not falsy, so it's truthy. So when our JavaScript engine tries to evaluate this, it looks at the first operand, it's false, so the search continues. Because with the logical OR operator, as you learned in the last lecture, as long as one of the operands is true, the result will be true. Now here in our second example, the first operand is false, so the search continues, hoping that maybe the other operand is true or truthy. In this case, we're dealing with a truthy value, so this value is immediately returned. The same goes for the third example. So here one is not a Boolean true, it's truthy. That's why the value of this operand is returned. Now, what if we have an expression like this? False or 1 or 2. What do you think we're going to get? Let's take a look. We get 1. So this is another thing you need to understand about the logical OR operator. The evaluation starts here. As soon as we find an operand that is truthy, that operand is returned. So here our second operand is truthy, its value is returned, and here the evaluation stops. It doesn't matter what we have on the right side. We could have a million other operands, they are completely ignored. This is what we call short circuiting. Short circuiting. Just exactly like short circuiting that we have in electricity. Now that you understand how these logical operators work with non-Boolean values, let me give you a real-world example of when to use this. So, let's imagine we're building an application and somewhere the user has to pick a color, or we're going to use a default color. Maybe this is the color of the t-shirt they want to buy. So I'm going to declare a few variables. User color, we set that to red. Default color, we set that to blue. And current color, which we set to user color or default color. Now let's read this expression in plain English. User color or default color. That basically means If we have a value for user color, we're going to use that. If we don't, we're going to use the default color. Now let's log this on the console. So current color, we get red because our user has selected a color. In contrast, if the user has not selected a color, let's set this to undefined, save the changes, we get blue because default color is blue. So this is the power of using the logical OR operator between non-booleans. With this technique, we can provide default values. So if the user has selected a color, we're going to use that. Otherwise, we're going to use our default color, and that determines the current color which we're going to display on the screen.